Howdy, Jacob here. Today we're looking at Optex Systems Holdings in the aerospace and defense industry. Very small company, just 54 million market cap, 53 million enterprise value. So for smaller companies, I do like to look at insider ownership, and we see percent held by insiders at 25.5%, which is pretty grand. That's a good amount of percent ownership, meaning that if you are an investor in this business, so is a lot of management, CEO, CFO, board members that are going to be likely doing what's best for the business because they themselves are heavy investors in the business. What we see here on a revenue side is two large declines year over year in revenue, but outside of that, they've actually grown pretty consistently and pretty heavily. Very small gross margin. It's increased from 13% up to 26%, which is big. And their operating margin most recently is 11%. So most of their expenses are going to be just cost of goods sold, not a whole lot of sales, general, and admin. They haven't paid a dividend in a bit. Return on invested capital recently looks pretty high. Let's see if there's any R&D. Nope. Balance sheet was pretty flat. We have 1 billion long-term debt, no short-term debt, 1 million cash and cash equivalents. So not terribly concerned with this balance sheet. They have 7 million total liabilities. I mean, it's just a smaller business, so definitely would want extra margin of safety. They appear to have positive free cash flow since 2017. Their use of free cash flow, I guess buying back shares. It's kind of tough to read this in the millions, but I think that's enough to get me to make some assumptions here. I think for revenue growth, I'd probably be comfortable with maybe a 7%. As for margins, average about 10 and 5. I would say, I don't know, the 10 is pretty heavily weighted by a big old margin of 2019. So for me, maybe 8 and 6. They do buy back shares 2021 and 2022, but not as much recently. So maybe just assume flat at this point. For terminal with 7% growth rate, not great. I mean, recently pretty good return on invested capital, but historically up and down. So this would be some, if you want to look into the business a bit more, where's that return on invested capital really going to be? What's the capital? What's the rate of return they can really get on the money invested back in the business? I feel like 17 seems to be pretty reasonable to me. 15% return. We're saying it needs to fall a little bit more than half before it gets to the return I'm looking for here. So I think it's a good business. It's a lot smaller of a company than I usually look at. I think there's a lot of opportunities with small companies that can arise since a lot of the analysts and everyone else isn't looking at them. So I feel like they can get out of favor a lot quicker and you can jump in on it. But for me, I just don't think it's at a price that's obviously cheap. So hope you enjoy the video. Have a great day.